Hi, everybody. Welcome to our, I believe, 7th seminar in our seminar series. As you know, this seminar series is part of a larger initiative funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where we want to advance the science on recovery community centers. And what we have done, or what we have, is we have a diverse steering committee consisting of scientists, clinicians, recovery advocates, leaders in recovery community centers, and you can see them here in their names. And what we really want to do is we really want to foster a conversation and collaboration between all these different groups of folks who, of course, involved and have relevant contributions to make to recovery and building the science on recovery community centers. Can you go to the next slide? What we try to do is we try to actually create materials for everybody that help us move the field forward, the science on recovery community centers. So as you know, we are recording this seminar series, and all of our previous seminar series have also been, our seminars have been recorded and are available for you. So you can just go to our website. You have a link here at the bottom to watch the videos from our previous presentations and download all the materials that were also shared at those times. And hopefully that's a useful resource for you to look at and for you to share with others as we are building the series. We also have a variety of resources. So we are currently working on this repository of useful scales. As you know, we have funding for pilot studies available. The letter of intent deadline is actually coming up on June 1st. And if you are interested in applying and you're looking for good measures to include in your outcome measures and relevant measures, take a look at our website. Hazel, you can go to the next slide. That kind of shows and that gives examples. So we list them here, and you can click on the link to get the actual verbatim items and scoring instructions, so you can kind of browse through it and see what works and what doesn't work for you. Okay, next one. I mentioned to you guys that we are trying to bring multiple stakeholder groups together. So we actually ask you every time to please tell us who you are, so we know who we are reaching and who we are not reaching. Sorry. So if you guys could take a moment to just complete this quick survey here. And you can scroll at the side here to get all the way to the bottom. And then there's a submit button. And then you are done. And Hazel, if you can let us know when we reach a higher percentage, like 70, 60, something like that, would be great.
Yeah, we're at 60% now, so I'll just wait a few more seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, votes are still trickling in. Okay, we just hit 85%, so I'm gonna end the poll now.
And can you share the results for at least the first one, so we know who we have here in terms of different stakeholders?
I can only share the results for all of them. Are you okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Yep. Whichever is easiest. More is better.
Okay.
Cool. So you can see we do have a number of different groups here. We have RCC leadership here. We have clinicians. We have scientists, advocates. We're still a little slow on getting prescribers to come. Lots of folks with lived experience, which is great because we need you here to inform the agenda on research. So this is great. And when you are talking with colleagues and friends, please refer them to our seminar series to have them be part of this. All right, next slide, Hazel, because I want to make sure I get to the actual important part. A couple of weeks ago, we realized that not everybody who comes to these seminars actually knows what a recovery community center is and really has a good feel, has had a chance to interact personally and understand what you all contribute to this. So we have decided to do this live feature where we invite a recovery community center to come here and speak about the work what you do at your center. And our guest today is Okata, and we have with us today Donna Woods, Timothy Smith, and Brent DeVore from the Oklahoma Citizens Advocates for Recovery and Transformation Association. And they will give us a quick tour of who they are and what they do. Take it away.
My name is Donna Woods. I'm the executive director and founder of OCARTA. And I think I'm supposed to kind of let you know, how it began. I was running a 54-bed treatment facility in Oklahoma City. And I realized that once those individuals from that 9-month to year residential program left, they fell off because there was no place else in the community to go. So we began as an advocacy agency, therefore our name, and began to fight for those rights for those individuals struggling with addictions and mental illness in the state of Oklahoma. We were the only one basically fighting for those individuals with addictions, because there were a lot of other different mental health organizations that advocated for that. I soon realized that it was not just enough to advocate for these individuals and make sure that the treatment doors stayed open and perhaps expanded, but we needed someplace in the community where they could meet, they could be in a safe environment, that they just didn't have that hour or two a day for self-help groups, etc. Therefore, I began with a SAMHSA grant. We started Sister to Sister 4-year program. We had 600 women, over 200 children. And by combining that authentic voice, which is that peer voice, along with making sure that they made their appointments, clinicians, no enabling. I will say that program started in 2006, and in 2021, those first individuals are still in recovery. So 87% of those women and children are still in recovery today, 20 years later. And that is the miracle of an RCO or RCC, is that we come together with them to trust the bills. We do all sorts of living skills, you know. I'm trying to rush here. So our program is all about breaking down those barriers so that we can stop the recidivism and relapse back into those systems of care. And by looking at each individual holistically, not just about their recovery, but everything else that keeps them in the community and build on recovery capital. Mr. Tim Smith.
Hi, everyone. My name is Timothy Smith. I'm the program manager for OCARTA in Oklahoma City. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. I kind of want to speak to how a participant would feel when they walk into our organization. So when they walk in, you know, we always work under the 8 dimensions of wellness. We want to focus on what their highest needs are. And of course, we also try as hard as we can to work under a housing first model. So having that said, we also, one of our main contracts with the state of Oklahoma's Department of Mental Health is our peer recovery drop-in center. So what that means is basically we're providing a safe space for people to come in and speak about their recovery, speak about their trauma, speak about anything that they need our help with in terms of our services. And also, so providing a safe space also means that, you know, we're taking DEI and LGBTQ2 matters into all of our programming and all of our services we're providing. So we are trying as hard as we can in every aspect of our organization to make sure that our organization is remaining a safe space for everyone to come into. Like I said, so when someone walks in the door to OCARTA, you know, we're assessing those needs based on the 8 dimensions of wellness. We're going to intake them into our system and then do what's called a recovery management plan. That's a lot like a treatment plan, but in the peer modality, it'd be a recovery management plan through RDP. We're right then and there, we're going to assess their needs up top. Is it housing? Is it employment? Is it a substance use disorder? Is it severe mental illness? And then kind of mitigate all of those factors in the moment with our recovery coaches and our recovery staff here. So that's about it for our programming. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to Obana.
Hi, I'm Obana. I am a peer recovery support specialist. I am certified. And the big thing about being a recovery support specialist is the fact that you are working on an equal footing with the people who have come to you. There is an emotional understanding and an emotional safety that comes from having lived experience of what they're going through. There is something about talking to someone who's not only been there, but has survived it and more importantly, thrived from it, that makes it comforting to know that there is hope. There is something after mental illness. There is something after addiction. And there are so many people who have said to me in the course of mentoring and peer support groups and so on, that they smile and they say, oh, so you understand. That feeling of understanding only comes from talking to someone who has lived through it and made something out of it. And I marvel every day that the thing where I was at my weakest point has become my greatest strength. And I'm able to share that. And I've done more than survive. I'm thriving, I'm loving life, and there's nothing better than for me than to be helping other people through their path to recovery, because everybody's path is different, but there is a certain necessity of someone really knowing what you're going through. And that's everything to me.
And so that's just a little bit and a small synopsis about what we do. You know, we'll open it up to any questions. I'm so grateful to be here. What an honor. And we hope we can share something that can help you on your path.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, for being here and telling us about your work and what you do. I'm sure what you said resonates with so many of us on so many levels. Thank you. I would like now to take the time to introduce Dr. John Kelly. Honestly, he probably doesn't need introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's, of course, the principal investigator with me on this R24 initiative. And more importantly, he's the director and founder of a Recovery Research Institute, which has been around since 2012, where our goal is always to bring science to everybody who it matters to and make it more accessible. So Dr. Kelly is the Elizabeth R. Spalding Professor of Psychiatry and Addiction Medicine at Harvard Medical School. I mentioned already, he's the founder of the Recovery Research Institute. He's also the program director of the Addiction Recovery Management Services at MGH and the associate director of the Center for Addiction Medicine. And Dr. Kelly has been a president of American Psychological Association's Division on Addiction. He's a diplomat of American Board of Professional Psychology. He gives talks in all kinds of venues. He speaks to government officials. He speaks to small groups of graduate students and to people in recovery and big and small venues. He's here to share his insights and his science. And today he's going to be focusing on the research he has led on recovery community centers. So John, take it away.
Thanks so much, Bettina. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can you see that?
I can.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Bettina. Thanks, everybody, and welcome, everybody. It's great to see you again. Thanks for coming. Hope you get something from this hour, and stay tuned. Check out the website and stay tuned into this area, emerging, I think, very exciting area of the focus on recovery support services, and in particular, this focus that we're charged with, Bettina and myself and our team, to really expand the research on recovery community centers. And hopefully today you'll understand why that is significant and why that is important. So I've entitled my talk today, One Stop Shopping for Recovery, because I think many of these recovery community centers are actually kind of like a recovery supermarket, and they provide different elements that can support people in recovery outside of the clinical setting. So this is kind of a roadmap of where I'm going to take you in the next 30 minutes. I'll just talk briefly about what recovery community centers are, for those of you who do not know. Why did they emerge and grow? What's the rationale for their growth? How might they work? And what do we know about their impact? And really today, I'm going to talk about a study that we did, Bettina, myself, others. We finished it about 2 or 3 years ago now. But it was the first kind of large-scale study of a particular region in the United States, New England and New York State, where we looked at all the recovery community centers. So I'm going to talk to you today about kind of the results from that preliminary study that we've completed. So what are they? So recovery community centers, for those of you who do not know, I know many of you do know already and have been tuned into our talks, but for those of you who don't know, they provide a locatable source of community-based recovery, peer-to-peer support through people with lived experience of addiction and recovery that can role model what recovery looks like on the other side of addiction and instill hope and provide that sense of meaning and purpose. They help individuals achieve sustained recovery by building and successfully mobilizing personal, social, environmental, and cultural resources. This is, in some, termed recovery capital. You can think of it as recovery assets. What are they not? Okay, so these get confused with other things like residential housing in particular for recovery. So they are not residential centers, they're not recovery housing, they're not sober living environments, they are not treatment facilities per se, even though they provide elements which are therapeutic. They're not 12-step clubhouses, but rather celebrate all pathways to and endorse and support all pathways to recovery. And they're not drop-in clinical centers, as I mentioned. They're not clinical entities. The principles of recovery community centers are that, as I mentioned, they provide a source of recovery capital at the community level. They provide different services than formal treatment, and offer more formal and tangible linkages to services and social services, employment, training and educational agencies than do something like a mutual help organization, which do not do any of those things. There are many pathways to recovery, and that's one of the other major things that is celebrated. All and any pathway to recovery is supported and celebrated. They're not allied with any particular philosophy or model. And I think in many ways, they may foster, these entities may foster or provide many of the presumed active ingredients of recovery that are reported by people in recovery themselves. That is to say, the sense of connection with other people with lived experience who can instill hope and optimism, who can help those individuals adopt a positive personal social identity and boost their own self-image and self-esteem, provide a sense of meaning and purpose. As the last speaker said, she was describing how her weakest link became her strongest asset. How meaningful is that? That you can help others through the own catastrophe that one has experienced in one's life. And then that sense of empowerment that comes through that process. So why did they emerge and grow? Well, here's why I think these things have come about. They've come about from people with lived experience who felt and experienced a need that wasn't provided for by clinical services. And part of it from a more clinical side is that we know how hard it is, how difficult it is to get and stay in remission. And this graphic just highlights just the challenge for people with the most severe problems. These are people with addiction, those with severe SUD, severe substance use disorder, the kind of people that we see in specialty care settings. It can take about 8 years after people start seeking help in adult clinical samples to get 1 year of full sustained remission. That's a big achievement right there to get that first year. But even after people achieve that first year of sustained remission, it can take 4 to 5 years to achieve stable remission. That is to say, you're no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the following year, which is roughly about 15% in the general population. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the following year, if you've already suffered from it and are in remission, can take 4 to 5 years of continuous remission. The good news is we have learned that about 75% do achieve full sustained remission, but it can take time to get there. So the question is what can we do about that? Is there anything we can do, or do we just have to wait for this inexorable course to play out? I would argue that I think we can do something. And I think this is where recovery community centers can play such a powerful role, as well as other recovery support services. I use this metaphor as a burning building, which I think is helpful. We have recognized clearly in the last 50 years of addiction science that we need to put out the fire. There is a building on fire. The person's life is in crisis. They're at risk, actually, of premature mortality. And sadly, we've been exposed to that too much recently with the opioid crisis. But we've recognized, yes, there is a crisis. There is a building on fire. There's a person who's in crisis, and we need to put out that fire. And we've become actually very good, happily, at providing that acute care, detoxification, stabilization, medication that can help people stabilize and put out that fire. Where we have been less focused is actually then, once the fire is out, is fireproofing the building and also helping that individual rebuild their life. How do we provide the building materials that can enable that person to get their life back on track? And importantly also is can we grant the building permit, which allows that person to also begin to get their life back on track. It's hard enough coping with the burden of the post-acute withdrawal phenomena which go on in early recovery without being stymied by being prevented from going through being able to get an apartment, to rent an apartment, to get a job because of a prior criminal conviction. So I think providing these building materials and building permits are so key, and it's these aspects which I think we've neglected and which recovery community centers and other recovery support services I think are provide and help people get traction through these other things. I like this model. This is from NIDA because I think it exemplifies and highlights some of the things beyond clinical care, which now NIDA recognizes are viewed as components of comprehensive drug addiction treatment. I don't think we would have normally associated things like vocational services, family services, educational services as being part of drug addiction treatment. But NIDA and others are recognizing that we have to think not just clinically, but also these social determinants of health. How can we address these other deficits that people face, the challenges, the building materials, the building permits that people need to move on in recovery? Now, we also know that addiction is a complex disorder. It's multifactorial, and it is mediated, of course, through changes in the brain. We now know very clearly exactly what neurocircuits and parts of the brain are affected through brain imaging and the fact that we've learned a lot about neuroplasticity, not just functionally, we can see structurally these changes. So coming back to this question, why is it so difficult for people to achieve these early stages in remission and stable remission? It's because the central nervous system is severely affected, is severely compromised, is severely adjusted through neuroadaptation and neurotoxicity. We know that, for example, that people have elevated levels of stress. They're hypersensitive to stress in these early months and sometimes years in recovery. And also, they have a down-regulated ability to perceive normal levels of reward because they've been exposed to this abnormally high level of reward through drugs. So this means that they're hypersensitive, they just can't feel reward. So this is a double whammy, which really makes it very difficult for people to get and stay in remission. And it's kind of highlighted here from another theoretical standpoint about allostatic load. And you can think about this as kind of the stress that people feel when they're trying to cope with these deficits early in recovery. Typically what happens is, of course, is that people, when there's some kind of crisis, maybe there's been a fire, an actual fire that was started, maybe they've been arrested, maybe there's an accident, an injury, a light bulb goes off in somebody's mind, maybe there's a family interaction, which gets the person who's addicted, gets their attention, and they decide to stop. They make an attempt to stop use. And there's this an alarming incident that happens, and then there's a period of resistance. And that resistance can last for so long before there's exhaustion. And the organism becomes exhausted because without support, without the kinds of things that can support and maintain that level of activation of their resources, they won't be able to sustain it. And this is why we see people relapse. So we understand now, of course, that recovery, not just addiction, is a complex process. And it's mediated here, as you can see in the middle of this diagram where the addiction was, is that recovery capital is these internal and social and cultural resources that people can draw on, can facilitate these changes in brain mechanisms through abstinence or substantially reduced use that can then facilitate recovery. So in other words, when we provide recovery capital, access to these resources, these building materials, it can reduce that biobehavioral stress and that allostatic load that can then help support ongoing remission and recovery. So recovery community centers that I'm going to provide some data on actually work to enhance remission and quality of life by helping to build recovery capital, which in turn helps to mitigate that stress and improve people's quality of life their sense of purpose and meaning and self-esteem, and help thereby to sustain remission. So what do we know about their impact? So I'm going to talk to you, provided that kind of rationale as to why they exist and why they've grown, what they can provide, and how, therefore, they can help sustain remission and reduce the risk of relapse. I'm going to talk about a study that Dr. Huckner and myself and others conducted a few years ago, where we looked at recovery community centers across New England, the New England states, and New York State. So there was about 40 centers at the time. That's increased massively now. I'll talk about that. But about the time we started this study, which was, I don't know, 8 years ago maybe, there was, for example, there was 5 centers, I think, at that time in Massachusetts. Now there's 35 centers. So just give you some indication of how much these centers have grown. So this study that we did had 3 major components, and I'm going to take you through each one, talk a little bit about the data that we have gleaned from them and what some of the implications and limitations are of the findings. So we did part 1 of the study was we did on-site visits to all of these centers, and we interviewed the recovery community center directors, and we surveyed the staff. So we wanted to find out kind of who was running them, who was working in them, how they were funded, etc. Cross-sectional survey. The next aim was a cross-sectional survey of existing RCC participants. So we had about 360 existing participants that we surveyed, that were involved in a survey, to find out what they were using, how they benefited, etc. And then in the final aim, we wanted to do a longitudinal study. So we recruited people who were just coming into the center in their first month, and then we followed them up and just did a 3-month follow-up. So it was ambitious. We were trying to do a lot here with fairly few resources. And these are the kinds of questions, of course, that we all want to answer, right? What are recovery community centers? Where are they? Who runs them? Who uses them? How are they funded? What do they provide? And how do they help people? These are the basic questions, of course, we all want to answer. And so we can hopefully shed a little bit of light on some of these questions, at least preliminarily. So what about the directors and staff? What did they have to say about how these centers were run and who is using them, et cetera, from their own perspective? By the way, we have these papers, which I'm going to talk about today. They're published papers. They're available for free. We can send them to you. If you want them, reach out to us. They're on the website, I believe, or we can get them to you if they're not actually located on the website. So we can send you these papers. And of course, this recording will be available for viewing later, and the slides also, of course. So there were 32 centers that participated in this study. There were 30 directors that participated, because sometimes the director was responsible for a couple of centers. And there were 59 staff that completed the online survey. So this first aim, where we interviewed, did on-site assessments, and then interviews with the directors and staff, we looked at these different characteristics. The physicality and locality of the location. Where was it located? And we did a rating that's used actually by J.D. Power and Associates, which is looks at kind of the quality of the environment. And so we use this structured rating scale as well to look at the quality of the environment, the buildings, and so on. We looked at operations and budgets. We looked at leadership and staffing. We assessed membership from the director's perspective, who's using it from their perspective, what they knew. And we also looked at services provided. And then in terms of the measures, we had, as I mentioned, the environmental rating scale. We used a walk score, which is Google's walk score, to look at how accessible these centers were, and then the usual things of quality of life and functioning and demographic variables. So in terms of the actual physical aspects of these centers, these 32 centers, they were generally rated as being moderately to highly attractive, in fairly attractive locations with fairly good quality physical structures. The 2 ratings that staff provided, the raters that were trained to provide these ratings, gave 2 ratings also, which was the referability. Would you refer a family member to one of these centers, and the attractiveness of the program? So you can see here these scores out of 3 were generally very highly rated. So in other words, these 2 individuals rated these centers as, on average, as being highly desirable in terms of wanting to refer one of their own family members there. So that was, I think, that's very good news. That they are perceived to be attractive entities and good places to send a family member. And also they viewed them as attractive. They were mostly viewed as very accessible in terms of walk scores. And you see here in terms of the catchment area at the bottom, they generally captured the population that they were meant to serve, largely urban. Most of these were, of course, in large population centers where the population exists. But of course, this raises another issue about rural access for people in or seeking recovery. What about operations and budgets? Now, this is fairly dry stuff. I'm going to get to some juicy stuff, but I do want to just mention some of these things, because what this does, it highlights the range of these centers in terms of their budgets and operations and size. You can see here they've been going about, at that time, this was about 5 years ago now. They've been in operation about 8.5 years on average. But you can see the range there, anywhere from 1 year, some of them are quite new, up to 33 years. So some of them were quite old. In terms of hours of operation, most of them were open on weekends and holidays, as well as weekdays. And some of them were open pretty much every waking hour. But many of them were open during work hours, but many of them operated pretty much every waking hour that people could use them. And you can see the budget here, the budget line, in terms of the operating costs, about $215,000 per year on average, but you can see there's quite a lot of variability. Anywhere from, if you look over on the right-hand side there, anywhere from $17,000 in annual budget for the center, up to $760,000. Okay, so that's a big difference, isn't it? So just shows you the extent to which some of these are operating. The breadth of the budgets, operating budgets for these centers. Most of them had paid staff, a cadre of paid staff. It varied a lot in terms of the number of paid staff to volunteer ratio. Some of them relied heavily on volunteers. Of course, those with lower budgets. Those with higher budgets tended to have more paid staff. The turnover rate in terms of staff was actually quite high, is actually on par with what we see in clinical settings, which is about 50% turnover rate within 1 year of working. So similar rates of turnover. And we can talk about what that might mean. At the bottom, you can see estimates, again, the director estimates of monthly visits from unique people. So these are individual, not people going back to the same person going back, but people with different people attending the center. On average, about 250 unique individuals attending each month. But you can see over on the right-hand side, you see that anywhere from 13 to 2,200, okay, unique people attending the center. So a lot of potential traction here, depending on the center, up to 2,000 unique individuals per month attending some centers. So that's a big big range. In terms of leadership and staffing, a slight majority were women among the directors. Among staff, about 70% were women, mostly white. Most, but not all, in recovery. I thought this was interesting. About 90% of directors reported being in recovery, 84% of staff. So not everybody was actually in recovery, which I thought was interesting, but obviously the vast majority were. And then in terms of the membership, I think this is an interesting data point. According to the directors, about 1 in 5 of their members were young people under the age of 25. So I think that's a kind of an important data point, just given what we know about how difficult it is to engage this age group in any kind of service, both in clinical services or recovery support service. So there may be something here that's worthy of further investigation. And that's a plug for our grants, and we'll talk about that later. We have these grants that we're giving out, $30,000 pilot studies, and there's a number of things that can be investigated. About half, according to the directors, of members were involved in the criminal justice system. About half were unemployed. The referral source, mostly from family and friends, self-referred, that is to say, treatment. Surprisingly few, perhaps, for criminal justice, given there was quite a lot of criminal justice involvement among participants. About half were criminal justice involved, and then a smattering of others, including sober homes. I thought this was interesting. You can look on the left-hand side here. You can see that how long people attending the center are in recovery. And this was from the director estimates. And you can see that, as you would expect, a lot of people in that first year are attending the centers. 31% in the first 6 months, 17% second 6 months. But look, there's another 27% in that 1 to 5 year range, and another 20% in the 5+ years. So people are utilizing the centers either for themselves, maybe giving back, but ultimately benefiting, of course, from giving back. But again, this is something that we need to learn more about. What is it that people are getting who are in more stable remission? Again, as I mentioned, it takes about 5 years to get into that stable phase of remission where you're no more likely than anybody else in the general population to meet for SUD in the next year. But people are utilizing it even beyond that. So that's an interesting, again, question mark about why, what are people getting from participation in the centers. On the right-hand side, you can see participation by primary substance of members. You can see mostly opioids and alcohol among participants, but a lot of variability. This just shows by primary substance across these centers what their primary substance was. You can see the blue is alcohol, the red is opioids, the yellow is cocaine, and that was the third most common substance. In terms of services provided, there was a great array of services which are highlighted here on this graphic. Most commonly were pretty universally was the social aspects, the peer support, the mutual aid groups, a variety of different mutual aid groups, all recovery meetings were present. But you can see this huge array of different services. And when staff were asked to rate the perceived importance, you can see there's variability in how important staff perceive these entities be to recovery. The social aspects definitely were rated very highly as being both present as well as being perceived as being helpful to recovery. Less commonly offered, but still fairly, frequently offered, as you can see, was the medication assistant treatment support for people on medications for opioid use disorder in particular. As well as Narcan training and distribution. Both were rated as very important to recovery, but weren't offered as frequently as other entities. And employment assistance and family support services, you can see, were also frequently offered and also rated very highly, along with housing assistance and recreational and social activities, which were universally offered across every single center and rated also very highly. So I'm going to move on in the interest of time onto the next phase. This ride gets, fasten your seatbelts, because this ride gets more and more exciting as we go on here. I'm going to talk now about some findings from our cross-sectional survey of existing participants. And again, these papers are available. We can send them to you if you want them. So the idea here was to look at, who's using the centers, okay? What are the participants like? Again, cross-sectional survey, about 360 people. participated in the survey. Examined kind of what they were using, again, how they rated it. This was, the prior data was from the directors and staff. What do actual participants, how do they rate these services? What do they use? And then we wanted to also look at the relationships between participation in the center and the gains in recovery capital and social support, and how that affected in turn quality of life, self-esteem, psychological distress, and how that relates to ongoing remission and recovery. So as I mentioned, we had about 336 people participate in this survey. The average age was about 41, about half were women. That was good. I think what was interesting and noteworthy is about 1/4 were sexual minority status, LGBTQ. So that, I think, again, is another important data point, that there's something about these centers that this particular group that is kind of doubly stigmatized find engaging and welcoming in these recovery community centers. And again, this is something I think to explore using one of our pilot grants. Another plug for our pilot grants. And we had predominantly white, about 3/4 were white race, and a substantial proportion were Hispanic. This is 11% in this particular sample, but it was higher in others, in other parts I'll talk about. Education, about half were high school or lower education. Very low income generally, and again, primary substance, either opioids or alcohol, some cocaine. About half had a lifetime psychiatric diagnosis, and the majority had had prior SUD treatment. The length of attendance among these participants was about 2 years, 2.5 years. About 35% were in their first year, about 50% between 1 to 5 years. Again, so we're seeing a lot of participation in that early elevated risk period, that 1 to 5 year period. But even beyond that, about 1 in 7 had 5 or more years of participation. And they rated it as being helpful to recovery and helpful to functioning and quality of life. And also reported high levels of recovery capital, quality of life, overall self-esteem, and lower levels of psychological distress. I think what was also interesting was that the quality of life here in this sample was a half a standard deviation higher than in our national recovery study sample. So even though that sample had people who had much longer lengths of recovery time, okay, up to 40 years, in this sample, despite the lower, shorter time in recovery, they actually had a substantially higher level of quality of life and functioning. So that is one of the data points I think is important to take home. That, again, is preliminary, but it suggests that these may serve a purpose in helping to accelerate the accrual of that quality of life and functioning. And this is why, because if you look in our national recovery study data, it takes about 15 years typically to get the same level of quality of life as a general population. So there's something about these centers which are maybe adding, accruing helping people to function better and improve their quality of life sooner. And this may in turn, of course, help to reduce relapse risk and elevate or reduce the time to stable remission. In terms of, again, this is from the participants themselves, what they were using and how helpful they found it. Again, it's highlighted here. So a lot of use of the social structures of social support, the mutual help, peer facilitated, and mutual help group meetings, as well as technology and employee assistance, housing assistance, basic needs, etc. What's interesting is in terms of the helpfulness here on the right-hand side in the blue column, you can see particularly highly rated were the opportunities to volunteer and give back. Again, that idea of the helper principle, which is a cornerstone of mutual aid and peer support, that helping you helps me. And that was valued very greatly and rated highly, as well as other things, particularly technology, being able to access computers and the hardware associated with making CVs, et cetera, letters, cover letters, and things like that. Narcan training was also rated very highly, but it wasn't offered very widely. Only about 20%. Only about 20% used that service. Excuse me. But it was rated highly. In terms of the relationships, when you think about, as I mentioned, we would hope that recovery community centers work to support people, to help support remission and improve people's functioning and quality of life. This is, of course, their intended purpose. And in fact, what we found was support for this specified model. We specified this a priori, and we actually found some nice support for it, preliminary support. It's cross-sectional, of course, from this sample of 330 participants, but nevertheless, it's something that gives us a clue of what's happening. What we found was that greater participation in the RCCs were associated with gains in recovery capital, which in turn was associated with improvements in self-esteem, quality of life, and decreases in psychological distress. And that in turn was associated with longer recovery duration. What was also interesting was that the social support for recovery was not associated with RCC duration, even though that's a major, of course, piece of it. And so, people come in, they can accrue that pretty well. They can also get that from mutual help organizations. So it may be that the recovery community centers themselves are providing something unique that is not provided by clinical care, nor is it provided by mutual help organizations. It provides access to this recovery capital, helps to boost that recovery capital, and in turn, and thereby improve these other aspects. This is one theory that we found support for. Again, cross-sectional, so you have to take that with a pinch of salt, but it's showing the right directions. So what about, the final thing I want to talk about is the longitudinal analysis of new participants. And to make a long story longer, but I will abbreviate here, but in terms of our new participants, we had about 400 initially start and do the baseline assessment. We only had about 50 to 60% follow-up, so we lost a lot of people along the way. I'll talk about why I think that is. And what we found in our third aim, where we looked at new people, so these were people in their first month of using the center, roughly, and then we followed them up. We did a baseline assessment, and we looked at their change scores in these same measures over time at the 3-month follow-up, okay? And we had about 50 to 60% follow-up. So we lost some people along the way, just couldn't reassess them. But this is what we found at the baseline. They were mostly young to middle-aged individuals, racially diverse, mostly single, mostly unemployed adult men and women with low income and education. So similar to the cross-sectional study. Suffering mostly, again, from opioid or alcohol use disorder, a history of comorbid mental health problems, and prior treatment utilization and recovery support services. When we looked at predictors of engagement, so what were the factors that contributed to more engagement in the RCC? What we found was accessibility was an important factor. If people could get there within 15 minutes, regardless of how they got there, whether they drove or took the bus or train or walked, if it was 15 minutes or less, that was a significant predictor of getting to the center and utilizing the center more. Also, Hispanic ethnicity, people of Hispanic ethnicity were more likely to attend, people with prior outpatient treatment, and people with slightly higher quality of life. You got to remember that the quality of life overall was much, much lower overall than in the general population. But relatively speaking, those who had a little bit higher quality of life, and it may be that you just need more functioning and quality of life to be able to get out the door and access these centers, because it's much lower than the general population, but have generally a little bit more quality of life and functioning was a predictor of participation. And what happened to these new members? Again, a little bit of a caveat here because we followed only about half, but of those that we were able to follow up, what did we find? We found that the new attendees showed benefits over time in terms of increasing the length of abstinence over time and decreasing problems, substance-related problems over time. There were significant benefits there. Also, we saw significant improvements in quality of life, self-esteem, and decreases in psychological distress, similar to the cross-sectional survey, those relationships I talked about earlier. Where we didn't, interestingly, where we did not see a benefit was changes in recovery capital in this first 3 months and changes in social support for recovery. Interesting. So why is that? I think it might be, there's one potential explanation, is that the participants in the study in this particular aim, they had to be new to the RCC, but didn't have to be new in recovery. So they could have been in recovery for a little while, longer than a month, but attending the RCC for the first time, and they may have had longer periods of recovery. So to end up, I'll just mention some important limitations to consider. As I've mentioned them a little bit in terms of being cross-sectional largely, but this is largely a cross-sectional study. We interviewed directors and staff cross-sectionally. We did a cross-sectional survey. We did one longitudinal aim, but there was no comparison group. So we can't say, well, all these gains are attributable to recovery community centers, right? Because we don't know, would somebody doing something else also show gains? So that's something that needs to be looked at down the road. Again, these are all opportunities for research. Because we were doing a lot in this study with fairly limited resources. Arguably the quality of what we were able to do was less. We just couldn't do it. But we wanted to do a first kind of glance, a first look at the utility of these recovery community centers. So I think one of the things that suffers, of course, with greater bandwidth is the level of detail that you can devote to any given aim or area. I think, for example, normally in our clinical studies, in our follow-up studies, our community studies, we engage people personally. We do in-person interviews. We really engage with them. We meet with them. We talk to them so they feel more a sense of trust. In this study, we just did online surveys, which meant that we had no personal contact, unfortunately, with the members. So that might be responsible for some of the loss to follow up that we experienced in this study. And hopefully in future studies, we'll be able to remedy that. And the other thing, as I mentioned, is that the quantity of RCCs has really rapidly expanded over the last 5 years. In Massachusetts, gone from roughly 5 to 35. And the same is happening in many different states around New England, around the country. And of course, the procedures, the types of services and the types of things happening may also have changed, as well as the norms. So again, that's something to consider when you're thinking about the inferences that can be drawn from this current set of findings. And I think, apologize for running up against time here, but let me just end with this, is that I think there's some consistencies, some inconsistencies across these three aims. The findings from the director report, from the cross-sectional survey, and the short-term longitudinal study show generally that we're seeing people utilize the centers who have primary opioid, alcohol use disorder histories, few resources, high density of clinical problems and histories. About 1 in 5 are young adult. About 1/4 identify as sexual minorities. A Hispanic ethnicity predicts engagement. About 50 to 60% are current smokers. Many in early recovery, but the substantial proportion in their first 5 years of recovery. There's a large, varied variety of different services offered that are highly valued. And there is a preliminary empirical support from the cross-sectional survey for the idea that RCCs may uniquely provide access to recovery capital that in turn enhances other functional and quality of life indexes, which can help shorten that time to remission. However, as I mentioned, some discrepancies in terms of, we didn't see a gain in recovery capital and social support, even though we did see gains in quality of life and self-esteem in that first 3 months in the longitudinal study. Again, I'll end with this because I like this this idea, and I think this is a true aspect of these entities, is that they do provide connection, hope and optimism, help people adopt a positive social identity and meaning and purpose and empowerment. So with that, I will stop talking, and I've sucked up all our time, looks like. We've got a couple of minutes. I apologize for that, but hopefully, reach out if we can. We've got time for a few questions, I think. I'll stop sharing my screen. Maybe a couple of questions. There's a couple of minutes to go. I'll hand back to you, Bettina and Hazel. Thanks, everybody.
A quick poll question. Thank you so much, Don. So I was wondering if we could quickly try to do the poll and then answer a few questions before we wrap up. So,
Sure, why don't you throw out the polling question? People can respond to that. And meanwhile, you can ask questions to John. John, while you were talking, several people mentioned traumatic experiences and trauma as a special area of needs interest, that the budget was wide, and wanting to know which communities actually got the high budgets versus the low budgets, the diversity of our samples, and those kinds of questions that you will see later. And I want to just mention to all of you guys that is exactly why we have these pilot study funds available, because there are so many burning questions. John highlighted a lot of them. You guys all highlight a lot of them. And that's exactly why we need more data gathering and more writing about this to raise awareness and to showcase what's happening and how the landscape looks like and how we would like the landscape to look like going forward. And do we have questions for John?
I will, by the way, I will stick around for a few minutes till about 1:15 if people can stick around and got questions as well.
John, you had mentioned something about this graph you put up and about people, how they get referred. And I couldn't tell if you were thinking that people who are going to the centers from the criminal justice system, that you thought maybe they should be more referrals from there, or that it reflected something else? Yeah, exactly. I thought that it was surprisingly low in terms of the number of referrals. I thought, given that a larger, much 3 times the amount were criminal justice involved, but only about 15% were reported being referred by criminal justice. So it may be that, again, that may have changed now. I think more people are aware, but I think I think criminal justice in general doesn't know, like many clinical settings do not know, that these entities exist in the communities in which they live. So we got to do, I think our task is to let people know that these are resources in the communities that they can refer to help, particularly people coming out of criminal justice settings that could really benefit from participation who have SUD histories. Well, just my thought about that is that for a judge to put it in someone's court minimus, that they have to go to the center, is a serious referral, whereas just saying, hey, we think that would be a good idea if you went over there. Because if they didn't go and it was required by court, it could lead to a violation of probation. Yeah.
So it looks like most people have voted in our poll now. Are we okay if I share the results of everyone?
Yeah.
So they should be up on the screen now.
Cool. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So this is trying to explain, why we didn't see this gain in recovery capital in our first 3 months. And most people thought that it was a bit too soon to see changes in recovery capital and social support. I have to say also that, again, they were quite high. These indices were quite high for these folks at baseline. And again, that might be because, as I mentioned, there was a substantial proportion that weren't new in recovery, but they were new to the center. So they were seeking the center out for some specific purpose that they weren't able to get on their own. And they already had, a fair amount of social support and recovery capital in that first 3 months. And yet, it's interesting, we see in the cross-sectional study the opposite. We do see this covariation in the expected direction with more participation and more accrual of recovery capital and social support. So it's interesting. We'll have to figure that one out. This is why more research is needed, ...
Hey there, I have a question. Speaking of ... I'm Kelly Bro. Hi there, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I look forward to seeing the recording of it because I had to unfortunately pop in and out like 3 times. So I was dotted, but John, when you look at and I just caught one piece that was so interesting about seeing the impact sooner or a little bit quicker, expedited with recovery capital and with the recovery centers. What do you think that's primarily coming from? I may have missed it as I popped out, but is it the social aspects of it? I mean, what do you think? I mean, I'll go back and watch the recording, so I don't want to ask something that's there, but what do you think? It's the social part, or that it's ongoing, or what part of it do you think it is?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. I think it's kind of attributable, definitely the social things, because it's the socials, it's the people, it's the lived experience, it's the warm, empathic, engaging peer support. I think that's attractive, engaging, welcoming, supportive. There's a buoyancy. And I was telling Bettina, it's like there's a life force. There's a life force in these centers that is very compelling and that is very attractive and engaging. And I think that social glue helps attract and engage people and then facilitates the rest of it. That then fosters and facilitates the accrual of the improvements in functioning and well-being. I think through the connections that people make and the visible role modeling of what recovery can look like, and the skill transfer, of what people did, how they cope with different situations, all of that condensed recovery assets and recovery know-how is condensed right there that people can access and utilize. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we see this benefit in terms of a quicker improvement in quality of life and functioning than we do in the general recovery population.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask one more question, then I won't. Is that I was going to see if someone popped in. Are you correlating that specifically to measuring how they see their life's purpose?
Well, that's something that could be done. We haven't done it. We didn't do that. We didn't have a measure of life's purpose in this study, in that particular study. But you could look at that. I would hypothesize that you would see a relationship between quality of life and functioning and people's meaning and purpose in their life. I think that would be, I would expect to see a correlation there. Again, that's something for more research.
Dr. Kelly, John Hulick here in Palm Beach County. Just wanted to weigh in real quickly. I appreciate your presentation. We're down here in Palm Beach County, actually ready on Monday to open up our second recovery community center. My belief, and I'll follow up with Bettina a bit more because I did reach out to her. I think the limitations of BARC, just in terms of the 10 questions, doesn't allow you for a really deeper dive into other aspects of recovery capital. So, because we clearly should expect, a greater kind of impact in those earlier months. So, I think some of that's just related to the BARC 10.
Yeah, and that was one of the kind of the theories that we had, is that maybe it is an artifact of the measurement. We're not capturing something. So thank you for highlighting that. Again, we're early days in this measurement of recovery capital. And there are studies going on now around the country that are developing measures to actually assess recovery capital. So we'll see what those bring. And if you all have ideas, please let us know. We want to collaborate with you, obviously, and learn more about how we can better measure all of these indices. So thanks for raising that.
Hi, I'd like to jump in here. Lorraine Barton from Step Rocks Recovery Support Center. I put a question in the chat about the space and budgets. Is there a way, or were you able to compare which centers got the highest funding versus those who got the lowest, and demographically where they based? In other words, where is it the lowest in poverty and the highest in the country club neighborhoods, or how did that measure out? And also looking at the space, like what was their space like, the type of salaries in comparison with other places? Was that data at all accumulated?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, there was a huge range, of course, in terms of the budgets, as I mentioned, of these centers. And there was also a pretty big range in terms of the attractiveness, the perceived attractiveness as rated by that standardized rating scale, which measures attractiveness. And here was something that was interesting, is that, and I'm hoping I'm answering your question here, I forget quickly, but was that, it was just an interesting data point that I want to mention, is that it wasn't always the case that the most attractive centers were the ones that the raters felt that they wanted to refer family members to. It was the social climate, which was the predominant factor that influenced their decision about whether they would refer. So in other words, it's not the makeup, it's the heart. It wasn't the makeup of the center. It was, the makeup, I mean, in terms of, makeup on your face, but in terms of attracting people, but that's a part of it. But it was the social milieu, the social climate, which was responsible for the rating. It was more strongly correlated with the ratings of whether someone would refer a family member there. So I thought that was interesting. And of course, it makes sense, right, that you'd want to refer a family member to a place that it's got a good heart, that's welcoming and warm and has a good vibe, as the raters put it. The budgets, higher budgets were associated with the provision of more services and resources at the centers, and also kind of more attractive centers. And again, this is an empirical question that we need to answer is, what do you need? What are the services that people really want, really need, really benefit from, and who needs them, and when do they need them? And these are the kind of questions we need to answer. Like I said, I don't know if I've really answered your question. I apologize. Always come back in if I haven't.
Okay, somewhat, but the core of the question is, where were the centers located that had the highest budgets?
Yeah.
Because I hear you when you're speaking of the programs, who got more money because they had more services, but you don't have the services until you have a center. So the center was built and created on a budget. And where were the highest budget, the better quote unquote centers created in what communities?
Yeah.
That's the
well, yeah. Again, it varies by state because it depends on how they're funded. Like in Massachusetts, for example, they're all funded via the state, right? They all get their funding via the state. So each center gets the same amount of money, and they're well funded. So they can be positioned wherever the population needs are. So it depends on who's funding them. In Vermont, it's a different story. There was far less state funding. Most of them were volunteer run. And so there was, at that time, and the 11 centers up there had very low budgets, mostly volunteers. And of course, Vermont is a much less densely populated state, like Maine also similarly. Now, Maine has increased in their capacity for these recovery community centers recently. Vermont has too. So interesting to see what the landscape is now. So I think they're generally located, to serve the population centers. But in terms of where they're located, I think it really depends on, how much money is allocated, where the funding is coming from. If it's state funded, you can pretty much put it where you want. If you're doing it yourself largely as a DIY shop, like in Vermont, then you have to rely on, kind of what's available, where you can put it, what money is available to locate it.
All right. So you didn't see any disparities in the funding?
Yeah, no, we didn't see it. Not that we've particularly looked at that particular question, I would say, but no. Again, it can be overridden by the.
I wonder if we can look at the zip code of where the RCCs are located at and compare it to the budgets, right? Because you can compare it to census data about average income, and then look at what the funding looks like. But as John mentioned, the systems are so different in each of the states, right? That it's tough to compare. There's only 32 of them, and each state is operating very differently, and there's large variations in how the centers came into being. So it's tough to draw an inference on it. We can take a look, but it would be pretty exploratory.
And I think now, I mean, if you think about, we had 32 in this sample. Now there are 35 just in Massachusetts, right? So, these have just grown exponentially. So if we were to do this now, we might find some, some new insights into all of this. So that's what I'm saying, is like, this is a rapidly changing landscape, and we'll have to see what we learn in the next few years as we do more research, and you all do more research on this.
And Lorraine, to your point about disparities and highlighting them, that's actually pretty much part of the survey that we're going to be doing soon. It's a nationwide survey of RCCs, where we really are getting the zip codes of each RCC and asking them what kind of services they provide and so forth. And the idea is to then see, where are these RCCs located? Is that equitable distributed in terms of which communities they're serving? So we can start teasing apart about, who has access to these resources and who doesn't have access.
And is there an interest, did you see or can you seek to find out if there's an interest in creating diversity at these centers?
That's actually part of the survey. And if you want, I can send you the preview of the survey right now, so you can look at exactly the items that we have. And then if you want to include other items, let us know and we'll include them. Would you like me to do that?
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you.
Cool. Do you have your email address? If not, if you can just put it in the chat, I'll grab it.
You should have it, yes.
Perfect.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, Laura, I think I have your email address. So I'll make sure to send you a link.
I think you do. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Hazel.
And thanks, Lorraine, for the questions. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks for coming. All right, well, I have to boogie now, but it's great to, thanks so much for the questions. We have other questions in the chat. I know we always pay attention to, we keep the chat and we look at that and organize the content of that so we can glean more of what your thoughts are. Thank you for doing that. I know we can't always get to all the questions, in real time, but we have those documented. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat also, because that's good for us to consider down the road as well. So I will say thank you.